Okay, I'm going to read Diversity in Early Care, Chapter 1, Perceiving and Responding to Differences. As a white middle-class American with mostly Anglo-Saxon and Celtic heritage, my Spanish surname comes from my husband. Obviously not me, I'm talking about the author. I was surprised to discover that I have a culture. I, like everyone else, move within a cultural framework every minute of every day. The framework is influenced by and includes what are called attributes of culture, some of which I am extremely conscious of, but some of which I'm barely aware of. My life is influenced by my race, gender, age, abilities and disabilities, language, social class, including status and economic level, ethnicity and national origin, religion and or spiritual practice, original geographic location of my family, where I grew up, and present location if it's different, and sexuality, including sexual orientation. My framework influences the way I think and act and how I perceive, handle, and interact with people and materials. It determines my notions of time and space and even influences my behavior related to those notions. Culture is unconscious. I move within this cultural framework as unconsciously as I move within the physical world I live in. I don't think about putting one foot in front of the other when I walk, and I don't think about my culturally determined actions, postures, or way of dealing with people. They're automatic. When I meet someone who obviously doesn't move in the same cultural framework that I do, I'm jarred. Because my way seems right, even normal, I tend to judge others based on my own perspective. I may consider them exotic or interesting, or I may consider them weird. But being a polite person who tries to get along with people, I do what I can not to notice because my way is normal to me. It seems rude to make an issue of the fact that someone else is not normal. And because I have a whole society behind me giving me the message that my people are the standard by which everyone else is judged, I can afford to keep on ignoring what I choose to. But I'm just adding in that if you want to be a teacher and a really good one, you can't do that anymore. So a narrow view. And guess what she says? But can I? What does this attitude do to me? It shields me from reality. It gives me a slanted perspective, a narrow view, and I miss out on a lot because of my perspective. Besides, it gives me a false assumption or impression of importance, letting me believe that my people are the only ones who count in the world, when in reality, white middle-aged Anglo-Americans, middle-class Anglo-Americans, not age, like me, are in a small minority of the world population. What does it do to those who are not my people if I continue in this narrow, slanted perspective, ignoring what I consider not normal? I train teachers and educate parents, therefore I have a lot of influence over the next generation. Imagine the harm I could do both to my people and to those whose differences I ignore when I carry out my job with this biased attitude. Imagine what my students can do to the children they live and work with when they define normality in the narrow ways they learn from me. What does it do to people who are different from me to have those differences defined as abnormal? And what does it do to people who are different from me to have those differences ignored? What are the effects of being ignored? That's an important question. What does it do to someone to ignore some integral part or aspect of his or her identity? My husband was born and raised in Mexico. Every now and then someone says to him, I never think of you as being Mexican. They mean this as a compliment. Because I'm not Mexican, I don't know how this feels, but I can imagine how I would feel if someone complimented me by saying he never thinks of me as a woman. That would shock me because being female is a vital part of who I am. And I don't want to be considered genderless. I don't want anyone to stereotype me because I'm female. I don't want anyone to hold my gender against me or treat me unequally either. But I wonder, I would feel very strange if someone made a point of ignoring a vital part of my identity. Of course, identity includes more than gender and where a person comes from. I may not be thinking of my race, class, sexual orientation, religion, and age unless I experience being a target of oppression because of one or more of those cultural attributes. I'm probably not thinking of how all those parts of my identity are defined by culture. I may not even consider how my culture isn't the same as everybody else's. Oh, I may not even consider how my culture and the culture of the in power are related, but my identity formation isn't the same as everyone else's. Everyone needs to become increasingly aware that when aspects of a person's identity make him or her a target of oppression, ignoring that aspect doesn't make oppression go away. The person is a target of oppression because one or more of those cultural attributes. Gay and lesbian parents may experience uncomfortable feelings when they enroll their children in early care and education program and find themselves the target of one or more persons' biased attitudes. This is an unfortunate situation for all concerned, but let's focus for a moment on the children of gay and lesbian parents. How do they feel when they get the message, spoken or unspoken, that something is wrong with their family? A basic tenet widely agreed upon in the field of early care and education is that all children need to feel that their families are acceptable to their teachers. That means they must not get the impression that their family is not normal. Also, they need to see their families reflected in materials throughout the program. And they need to be able to talk about their families and hear about families like theirs. When gay or lesbian parents enroll their children in early care and education programs, it is vital that they are greeted with the same attention and respect afforded every other family. No matter what the staff's political or religious views are about marriage and families, the ethics of early childhood are clear as stated by the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAEYC. Code of Ethical Conduct. Principle 1 of the position statement reads, above all, we shall not harm children. Other pertinent ethical statements from NAEYC are included under Section 2, Ethical Responsibilities to Families. Among others, the ideals are to 1, develop relationships of mutual trust and create partnerships with families, and 2, welcome all family members and encourage them to participate in the program. To respect the dignity and preferences of each family and to make an effort to learn about its structure, culture, language, customs, and beliefs. That was the third one. One of the purposes of this book is to promote equity and stand up against oppression. People can do that by broadening their views. Part of broadening one's views includes exploring notions of what's considered normal. The term is often used to mean what is typical, regular, or natural without reference to any normalizing procedure. The official definition used by human development experts relates to norms. That comes from research on some particular group of people. Knowing that definition of normal should bring up some questions, such as what group, under what circumstances, and in what environment? Who were the researchers? Were they the same language, culture, socioeconomic background, race, religious group as the subjects? Were they the same gender? How many people were in the sample? See point to ponder 1.1 for more questions about defining people by using the word normal. And it says in ponder point number 1.1, what's normal? Defining normal involves comparing people, which we don't do. For some cultures, comparing individuals is inappropriate, so they never think in those terms. In the field of special education, using the term normal brings up its opposite, which is abnormal. For a child to grow up being labeled abnormal can have a negative effect on his identity unless someone has managed to give the term positive associations. So we don't want to be using normal and abnormal as things that we are labeling people in terms of their family, their disability, their identity. Okay. Some years ago, when women looked at norms in the medical field, they created a movement toward defining women's health issues and questioning the existing medical standards that at the time came from studying mostly men. Good Lord. Just as men's health was looked at from the view of male research, much classic child development research came from the university laboratory schools, which had a preponderance of children from white, middle-class, educated families. See ponder to point to ponder 1.2 for something more to ponder about the subject of norms and research in the child development field. And I'm going over to read that now. The 5% phenomenon. Child development books are sprinkled with diversity these days, yet most authors don't point out that historical research was done by Europeans on Europeans and that today the field is heavily influenced by the United States. According to Helen Penn and Peter Moss, in a paper called The 5% Phenomenon, The research reported in most child development texts represents only 5% of the world's children. Oh, good Lord. Yet the implications of this research are considered universally applicable. Think about how few people in the field of child development know about 95% of the world's children, many of them who live today in the United States of America. Anyway, broadening the view, which apparently we need to do. We each need to look inside and discover how often we define people and their behaviors as normal by our own standards. I, for one, am working to raise my awareness so I can broaden my own perspective of what's normal and quit applying a single standard for adaptive, healthy, competent behaviors. I have a strong desire to quit ignoring differences and begin not only to notice them, but also to celebrate them. I want to look at differences as sources of strength, not abnormalities or weaknesses. I don't expect to change all at once. In fact, I've been working on this shift of perspective for a number of years. Revising one's view can be a slow process. So I think this is really important. It's like when I stopped thinking I can say no, unless it's like an emergency and someone's about to be hurt with kids. You will learn how to say everything as a positive statement. Use your walking feet, use your inside voice. But also, I think for identity and building self-esteem, we need to not talk about, oh, well, that's not normal. No. Okay, so this is my unique child, such and such, and the things I'm celebrating about this person or this child are, and like for me, I have ADHD. Now, I've been in a lot of meetings with students who think that that's something is a reason they don't do well. And I've tried to get people to change their idea about that. Like I said in a meeting, I said that ADHD is like my superpower because I can like have 5 things going at once and I just keep going and I get a lot more done than other people, even though I have ADHD. So there's, things that some people think that it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, I think ADHD can look different in people. So what my experience is might not be someone else's, but there are ways to deal with certain things that people if you've always been given a message, there's something wrong with you and this is a reason you can't do something, then our job as teachers is, like Vygotsky says, is to meet them where they are at zone of proximal distance and then allow them to go beyond their, to strive for their potential, which is not, you don't do that when you limit them by saying, well, he has ADHD, he can't do that, or whatever. All right. So now we're going to talk about cultural pluralism. And I have to say, I'm glad I'm reading this because like in my head right now, I couldn't define it, if you ask me. So in less personal terms, the ideology on which this book is based is cultural pluralism. Cultural pluralism is the notion that groups and individuals should be allowed, even encouraged, to hold on to what gives them their unique identities, while maintaining their membership in the larger social framework. Mutual respect is the goal, though it isn't easy because at least in the human development education fields, we've been taught a deficit model where intellectual, family, and mental health practices that differ from mainstream middle-class norm are not viewed as cultural differences, but as defects or inadequacies. So we need to reset our brains to think these are the characteristics about this person and this person's family, and not think about it necessarily as this is what's wrong with them, right? A further word about cultural pluralism, and I think that's a fancy word. We're still talking about identity here and intersectionality, seeing every child in our class and their families as human beings that are unique and bring something important to our community. A further word about cultural pluralism. It's hard to say that. It's important to understand that I'm not advocating separatism. We live in this land together and we need to get along. We can't each remain behind our own closed doors as individuals or as groups. We can't automatically place individuals with differing abilities into separate programs or institutions. The point of cultural pluralism is to promote diversity. That's our second ABE goal. The goal of diversity is unity. Only when we can come together freely as we are, feeling good about who we are, can we create a healthy unity among all the people of this great society. It may seem as though unity and diversity are opposites, but one of the themes of this book is to look closer at opposites and see how they are really two halves of a whole. It isn't unity versus diversity. That's only the case if you define unity as uniformity. I don't, and I really don't. I'm not just reading what's on the page. My goal is unity through diversity. See Point to Ponder 1.3 for a metaphoric example of what happens when you create unity by blending instead of mixing diverse elements. And this is what I'm always talking about in my classes, and my students are like, we don't know what you're talking about. And I'm probably not explaining it very well, so here it is in a book. Should we be a melting pot or a tossed salad? Well, think about a tossed salad. If you combine several kinds of lettuce and various other ingredients like onions, tomatoes, cucumbers, mushrooms, red bell peppers, artichoke hearts, you have a delicious dish. Each ingredient retains its identity, texture, color, flavor, and those all contribute to the unity of the whole salad. Now imagine putting that salad into a blender and pushing the liquefy button. I'm thinking of the juicer diets that we have been so popular. So that the ingredients become one. I've done it. All the uniqueness disappears and it becomes a slimy green or gray mess, depending on the ingredients of the salad. I didn't have the guts to taste it. That's the difference between the goal of unity as uniformity compared with unity through diversity. And then Gandhi said, our ability to reach unity and diversity will be the beauty and test of our civilization. And that's certainly turning out to be true. Cultural pluralism and early care and education programs. You can't remove from your cultural framework the ways you relate to children and guide their behaviors. Plan a curriculum, set up the environment, handle caregiving routines, and carry out parent education. Your behaviors are determined by your values, which are cultural, familial, and individual. They are also determined by what you consider normal, which can be influenced by your race, ability, social status, income, sexual orientation, religion, age, and or the messages you've been given about yourself in regard to these aspects of your background and identity. To aim for cultural pluralism in an early care and education program, you must have a clear understanding of differences. You must see where child and teacher behavior fail to mesh so that you can make adjustments. You must know and respond to the parents' goals, values, and beliefs related to care and education of their children. You must know how to meet their needs in culturally appropriate ways. It may seem that cultural differences have little to do with the nitty-gritty of meeting children's needs. After all, how many different ways can there be to feed, clean, carry, dress, and touch children, and provide for rest and warmth? Where do the cultural differences come in? The differences show up in the way the needs are met, in how teachers and caregivers interact and relate to children, in the issue of body language and nonverbal communication. Culture is learned very early, and early childhood theoreticians and practitioners can't afford to ignore this fact. The term needs appears 3 times in the 3 preceding paragraphs. Look at Point to Ponder 1.4 and consider the terminology and the difference between children who have needs and needy children. Becoming aware of images of the child. Although I'm using the term needs, I hope you don't get a picture in your mind of needy children. The images that we have are powerful, and thinking of needy children is a little like thinking of developmentally disabled children or crippled children. There is a movement in early care and education to put the child first before the descriptor or label to emphasize humanity. You think? A child should never become a label. In other words, a child may be physically challenged, but that doesn't mean he or she is a crippled child. Children have needs or a developmental disability. It's not a matter of being politically correct. It's a matter of the images we carry in our heads based on the terms we use. These images influence our attitudes and thus our behavior. So, of course, I hope that you would not be thinking of that's the crippled child. Please don't do that. Okay. Anyway, babies are raised to be members of their cultures. Look at an example of how differently 2 cultures relate to their babies. The difference reflects what the adults in each culture believe is good for babies, which in turn reflects their varying value systems. Here's the example in a classic piece of research when comparing 3 to 4-month-old infants in a middle-class home in Japan and America. Cottle and Frost found that American mothers, they mean white European American mothers, talked to their babies more, and Japanese mothers spent a good deal of time lulling and soothing their babies. The Americans were stimulating their babies. The Japanese were doing the opposite. So what? What does it matter if those parents spend more time stimulating their babies and others spend more time calming them? Well, it matters a lot how the babies adults treat babies affects those babies' behaviors and personality development. As Caudle and Frost found, the result of the differential treatment was that the American babies were more physically and vocally active and the Japanese babies were less so. Caudle and Frost concluded, thus, because of the different styles of caretaking in the two cultures, it appears that by 3 to 4 months of age, infants have already learned or have been conditioned to behave in culturally distinctive ways, and that this has happened outside awareness and well before the development of language. In other words, the European American mothers were making their babies into the kinds of people who would fit their culture, and the Japanese mothers were doing the same. Think about what might happen if the babies were handled some of the time by European American mothers and some of the time by Japanese mothers. They might turn out to be bicultural people, compartmentalizing their differential treatment. Children do that. They know they are treated one way by this person in this setting and another way by another person in another setting. Wow, they're really smart. However, instead of becoming bicultural, they might become confused about how they are supposed to be. This is the case, the environment with the foreign mother might be called culturally assaultive. Babies and young children become acculturated to the distinct individual and cultural rhythms of their teachers and caregivers. They learn synchrony that in some cases seems to be culturally specific. Cultural differences are real, but so is stereotyping. Read the caution in point to ponder 1.5, which says that just because you know a person's culture doesn't mean you can predict his or her behavior. This is where the stereotyping comes in. So, predicting behavior. When you read about mothers in Japan, and was it similar to any ideas you already had about Japanese people or about Asian people in general? The danger of labeling cultural differences and relating them to a specific culture is in feeding pre-existing stereotypes. If you think of Japanese people as calm, quiet, and passive, and you meet a Japanese mother who's outspoken and who stirs her baby up by bouncing and jiggling, what would you do with that new piece of information that didn't fit your preconception? Many people, instead of recognizing that they're stereotyping someone, would maintain their stereotype and just classify the person who doesn't fit it as different. The next time they meet a Japanese mother, they will still have the same expectations of what this person will be like. If there is one message I want you to take away from this book, it is this: knowing a person's culture doesn't mean you can predict their behavior. Barbara Rogoff, in her book Apprenticeship in Thinking, writes about guided participation. She notes that children pick up important things from adults, even if there are no lessons or conscious efforts to teach. She makes a good case for much of learning happening early and being culturally specific. One example she gives from the research of Michaels and Kasdan has to do with differences in the way young white children and young black children tell stories. The two styles are distinct, and interestingly enough, though, white adults see the white style as superior. Of course, as a result of these differing opinions, white teachers at sharing time tend to interrupt the black children and instead of helping them, actually hinder their storytelling. Difference is deficiency in their minds. We must avoid leaving children with the impression that they are wrong when they do what they have learned at home and instead accept them as they are. Acceptance doesn't preclude teaching them other ways of doing things. The teaching should be done so it adds to their skills and doesn't take anything away from them. Rogoff's concern and mine is that children who are grounded in one system and are attempting to function in another experience numerous difficulties. The ideal is that children benefit from learning new cultural systems and still keep their home culture. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. More often, the dominant culture competes with the home culture, and the home culture loses. This happens especially when the program's goals, whether conscious or unconscious, is to eradicate the home culture. When children encounter such subtractive processes, they fail to grow up with bicultural skills and identities. Huge identity issues arise when children grow older and become disconnected from their families. The beginnings of losing home culture can start early, even in infancy. The childcare profession has an enormous responsibility to keep children and families together and to promote healthy development of cultural identity for all children. Okay, I'm going to stop there as part one.